So today we are joined by Dr. Catherine Musemeche, the author of Lethal Tides, Mary Sears, and the marine scientists who helped win World War II. Dr. Musemeche trained at one of the elite children's hospitals in the country, Children's Memorial Hospital of Northwestern University in Chicago, and has been a pediatric surgeon for more than 3 decades. She also has an MBA from the University of New Mexico and a JD from the University of Texas School of Law. Her first book, Small, was longlisted for the E.O. Wilson Penn Literary Science Award and was awarded the Texas Writers League Discovery Prize for Nonfiction in 2015. She's also contributed to the New York Times Motherlode blog, KevinMD.com, and EMS World, and she lives in Austin, Texas. We're delighted to have her with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Musemeche.
Thank you for that outstanding introduction, and I'd like to thank the Ray family. Larry and Julie, it's been great spending a little time with you and getting to know you, and I want to thank the oceanography department, the history department, my handler for today, Commander Jessica Garrett. It's been great getting to know her a little bit. Let me just back this up a little bit. There we go. Around 2018, I got interested in writing a book about Commander Mary Sears, who had been an oceanographer during World War II. And from the beginning, when I heard about Dr. Sears and what she had done, at a time when less than 5% of scientists in this country were women, I was really taken with her story, and I was trying to figure out how I was going to tell it. And from the beginning, I saw it as a war story, an adventure story. I wasn't trying to write a history book. I wasn't trying to write a science book. I wanted to tell this like a big, crazy adventure with a lot of heroism, sacrifice, failures, near failures, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat, tragedy, and ultimate triumph on the brink of disaster. And I didn't have to make any of that up, because that was us in World War II. That is how World War II unfolded. And as Commander Grace Hopper said, I said, we have a new building named after Commander Hopper. She said, she was very active during World War II. Everything was hurry up, get it done yesterday. And that is exactly what was happening with oceanography in World War II. As Mary Sears always said, the Navy went to war without knowing anything about the ocean. Now, it's a little hard to imagine they knew nothing about the ocean, but from her perspective, as a marine biologist, the Navy just wasn't prepared to go to war. And she spoke about this often in her oral history. So anyway, I started working on this book in earnest in about 2018. And I remember my editor asked me, he said, Kate, how long do you think it'll take you to write this book? I said, oh, I'll have this out in a year. Well, 4 years later, it came out. And as you know, there was a little blip on the screen during that time known as COVID. And I was working very hard to conduct my research and get the information. And I very much wanted to get this science of oceanography. I wanted to get it right, because I am not an oceanographer. I wanted to get the history of the amphibious forces right. Again, I knew nothing about this before I started writing the book. And so I was working very hard all the time. And I was never sitting around going, I wonder who I'll be talking to when this book comes out in August of 2022. Because let's face it, we didn't know if we'd ever leave the house again when COVID was going on. I wasn't planning a book tour or anything like that. People, writers their book tours were getting canceled, and they were Zooming and doing all this other thing. So, eventually the book did come out. One of the first groups to reach out to me was the Naval Oceanographic Office. And I, of course, had written a little bit about the Naval Oceanographic Office in this book. And they reached out to me and they invited me to come talk about the book. And at first I was excited, but then, the reality started to sink in that I was going to be talking to, honest to goodness, naval oceanographers about oceanography. And I was just horrified, thinking, oh Lord, what's that going to be like? I mean, I tell people my knowledge of the ocean stops at 1945. So I went over there to the Naval Oceanographic Office in the Stennis Space Center, having no idea what I would find. And actually, a few days before I got there, they sent me this itinerary. And at first, most of the time when you go out and you talk to people, you're going to be there maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours. Well, there was this all-day itinerary of all the people I would be meeting with and talking to, including oceanographers, of course. And I have to tell you, it was with a little trepidation that I approached this trip, not knowing just, what kind of questions I would be asked, or, maybe they're just going to spend the day telling me how much I had screwed up about naval oceanography in this book, which, I probably deserved. But when I got there and when I met the people, what I realized was that they were just so grateful that someone had written a book. They saw this as a book about them. And I'm not kidding you, people lined up after my talk to shake my hand and to thank me for finally bringing some much deserved recognition to naval oceanography. And I was just overjoyed to meet these people. And one of the things I found out when I was there, I went to they have an oceanographic library there, as I'm sure many of you know, and I went there on a tour, and they have a wall of portraits, and they call this wall the ships. And the portraits are of the individuals that the ships have been named after. And most of these people are explorers. Some of them are scientists who have made great discoveries. There was one woman's portrait hanging on the wall. I did not know it was there. It was Commander Mary Sears, who I'd written my book about. And what I realized was that they viewed Mary Sears as the mother of naval oceanography. She was their patron saint. So I continued to learn things about Mary Sears every time I've been someplace talking about her. And as one young woman pointed out to me, an oceanographer, she said, Dr. Musemeche, if you keep going to these talks and learning all this stuff, your knowledge of oceanography is actually going to advance past the year 1945. So you better watch out. You're going to know more than what you ever dreamed of. So the story of how Mary Sears gets involved in oceanography, it begins with the attack on Pearl Harbor. On that day, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese, this unexpected attack, they inflicted, 3,000 casualties. They took out a third of our Navy, something like 160 aircraft were put out of commission. And this forced our country to declare war 27 hours after the first bombs were dropped. And even though the Japanese had not inflicted the fatal blow on our Navy that they intended, it certainly crippled the forces in the Pacific. It was a very scary time for national defense because, the Japanese had come over to Pearl Harbor and there was nothing, and they had attacked and captured other islands right after that. There was nothing to keep them from coming to the United States, California. People were scared to death. And as our president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, confided to his wife, he didn't know how we would go about fighting this war in two oceans without having a full Navy. He didn't know what we were going to do. He only hoped to stave off disaster until we had built enough ships to get up to speed for that. So we were thrust into this two ocean war, and we were already fighting in the Atlantic Ocean. Here on the left, we weren't really fighting. We were protecting merchant convoys that were going back and forth between the United States and Great Britain. We were helping to defend. Well, after Pearl Harbor, we were thrust into defending the Pacific Ocean and fighting in the Pacific Ocean. 64 million square miles of ocean that overnight we were going to have to defend, fight in, and we knew nothing about it. We knew very little about the Pacific Ocean. Now the Brits, they knew a lot about the Atlantic Ocean. They had been at war for several years already. But it was going to be our main job to figure out the Pacific Ocean. And we didn't really have a plan for what that would be. And unlike World War I, our troops would get on convoys. They would go over to Europe. They would unload in friendly harbors. There was no one fighting their way into the harbor. They would get out, have a cigarette, chat with their buddies, and then make their way to the front. World War II was a very different kind of war. We were going to have to employ large-scale amphibious attacks all throughout the war, particularly in the Pacific, for the very first time. And we didn't really know a lot about how to do that, even though there were people in our military that had a Major Pete Ellis, who was a Marine Corps officer. He had anticipated the need for defending ourselves against the Japanese in very much the way that we needed to, and he had come up with an operations plan. But in between World War I and World War II was something called the Great Depression. So there wasn't a lot of extra money sitting around for people to go out in boats and pretend to, land on enemy shores and to fund the development of the amphibious forces. So they were not rehearsed, they were not practiced, they were learning it all on the fly. So Mary Sears was a marine biologist who was a scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. During World War II, Mary Sears happened to be on a fishing trawler off the coast of Peru. And the reason she was there, Peru had a large population of guano birds. And the guano birds produced fertilizer, which was one of their main crops and a big economic driver of the Peruvian economy. And they had a problem where their bird population started dwindling, which was really going to affect their financial situation over there. So initially, an American ornithologist named William Vogt, he went over there to try to figure out why aren't these birds, why aren't they thriving anymore? And he came to the pretty quick conclusion that they were starving. And they were starving because something had happened to their food supply in the ocean. So he got hold of Mary Sears, who was a planktonologist. She studied the lower life forms there in the ocean. And he sent for her. He called her up and said, "Can you come over here?" And Mary Sears said, "Well, heck yeah, if you're going to pay my way, I'll get over there and see if I can help you figure this problem out." One of the reasons she left the safety of the United States and traveled in dangerous waters to get to Peru, it was because at that time in our country, women were not allowed on research expeditions. So she knew if she was ever going to get out on a boat, a ship of some kind, even if it was just a fishing trawler, she had better go on over to Peru. But this thing about women not being on research ships, it goes back to the time of Odysseus. And ancient Greek thought that women were somehow unlucky on board ship, that they would incite the sea gods, that there would be catastrophe if a woman was on board. And it was a little bit ironic that this was the philosophy, because you would also find women figurines carved into the bow of a ship and scantily clad at that. And it was a little bit ironic that they held these superstitions about women. But it persisted even into modern times, and it was like women would distract the men. We didn't have separate bathrooms. We didn't have separate sleeping quarters. So Mary Sears was never allowed on board an expedition ship in the United States during her entire career. So that's why she was in Peru. But she did come back. So Pearl Harbor, December 1941, she came back in March of 1942. And she returned to Woods Hole, and she noticed immediately Woods Hole had been taken over by naval research. Everything had transformed. We're no longer into marine biology. We're into physical oceanography and developing instruments to help us fight the war. And she noticed one by one men that she had happy hour with at the end of the day at the Captain Kidd's bar across the street. The men were going to war. They were disappearing. They were going overseas. And she wanted to go too, but she couldn't. The first hurdle was the law had to change, and it did change in 1942. It changed first for the Women's Army branch. Women were allowed into an auxiliary branch of the Army, and then the law changed in July of 1942 to allow women into the auxiliary branch. It wasn't an auxiliary branch. It was just another branch of the Navy. So as soon as women were allowed into the Navy, into the waves, Mary Sears went down to the recruiting center and she applied to go. She very much wanted to go. She was very patriotic. She couldn't wait to go. And they turned her down. And the reason they turned her down is she had had an infected finger several years before, and someone had called it in her medical records arthritis. And the Navy was like, nope, we're not taking anybody with arthritis into the Navy, even if it's just going to be a woman scientist that's going to be doing research or whatever. That infected finger history will definitely affect her performance. So she's going to have to sit on the sidelines, and she was not allowed to go initially. But what happened was there was a great need for an oceanographer at the Naval Hydrographic Office. And they basically Mary was able to get a medical waiver so that she finally did get into the Navy in April of 1943. So think about that for a minute. We have been at war for a year and a half without a full-time oceanographer in the Navy. We're fighting in this two-ocean war, and we don't have very much information. But it took this long for someone to take that job. And initially she was alone. Someone had crammed a desk into the Maritime Security Division at the Hydrographic Office, and that was Mary Sears' cubbyhole initially, until more stuff happened and she was able to recruit some other people to join her. So the Hydrographic Office at the outset of World War II, it wasn't doing a lot of oceanography. In fact, the word oceanography, it hardly even existed in our vernacular. Oceanography was just coming of age as a science, and most people who were oceanographers had backgrounds in either marine science or chemistry, geology, something like that. But you couldn't go get a degree in oceanography. It just didn't exist. So the Hydrographic Office they were mainly a place that made nautical charts and supplied shipping and the military and everybody with all these nautical charts. Well, you can imagine that all of a sudden we're in this global war and we're fighting in ocean and waterways where we've never been before, and there was this unprecedented demand for charts and navigation aids and all this stuff. You know, the Navy could figure out where they needed to go if they had a map to the place, but they didn't know they still didn't know what they were going to find when they got there. They didn't know anything. What are the tides going to be like? What are the waves going to be like? What is the bottom sediment, the angle of the shore? They did not have any of that information. So this tiny agency, which initially was in Washington, D.C. and then moved to Suitland, Maryland, it was just inundated with requests for information and new charts. And it got to be, before the war in 1938, their output was about 500,000 charts a year. And by the time the war ended, it was 14 million charts a year. And that just shows you what the demand was for the maps, for the physical maps. Not to mention all the questions that were coming up about the oceans. And initially there was just one person, Mary Sears, trying to answer some of these questions. And then what happened was she recruited some of her friends from the world of oceanography. There was FINHSS, who was a hermit crab specialist, who she had known at the Smithsonian when she was a graduate student. There was Dora Henry from the University of Washington, who was known as Barnacle Lady, and she had kind of an interesting sideline. When the police pulled a corpse out of Puget Sound, they would call up Barnacle Lady, and she would come over and she would scrape barnacles off the pants and the shoes of the victim, and she could help them figure out where the body had come from by the species of the barnacles and how long the body had been in the water. You know, had the barnacles reproduced, were there several generations, what have you. So that was kind of an interesting sideline. And then there was this amazing woman on the far right, Mary Greer, who was an oceanographic librarian from the University of Washington. And she was a very interesting character, very quirky. And at the outset of the war, the University of Washington's Department of Oceanography closed because their department chair, Tommy Thompson, there's a ship named after him now, Tommy Thompson went into the service, and so this closed. And Mary Greer had to get a job at the Boeing plant doing quality control. And I can just imagine how excited she was when she got the call, hey, come to DC and come back and do some oceanography with us. You know, come help us find the information we need to leave the war. So she could leave that job behind and jump on a bus and spend probably 2 or 3 days getting to Washington, DC. There were some other people assisting Mary Sears and her group. These were there were 350 waves at the Naval Hydrographic Office during World War II. And the Navy needed every single one of them. So I'm just going to run through a few of the things that Mary Sears worked on while she was there. And one of the first projects that was assigned to her, and right out the bat, Mary Sears was appointed to the Joint Chiefs Subcommittee on Oceanography. I mean, that was just amazing to me that she was on a Joint Chiefs Committee. The only woman, of course. And I was able to get the minutes of these meetings from the National Archives. And you could kind of see, you know, what was happening before Mary Sears got there and what happened after. And what was going on before she got there, it was a lot of, how should I put this? I don't want to call it whining, but I will say there was a lot of talk about, hey, we need this, we need that, we better hurry up and get this stuff, we need to get these things going. Once Mary Sears showed up, stuff started happening. You could see reports started getting done. Now, I'm not saying she did them all, but I do think she was a consistent presence because, again, the people on the Oceanography Committee, they were naval officers, they were coming and going. Well, Mary Sears was never going to go. She wasn't going to go on a ship or be sent overseas. So we had this constant presence, making sure that things get done. And that was what she did. One of the first projects she worked on was predicting the drift of an object at sea. And what was happening in World War II was that a lot of airplanes were ditching into the ocean. Aviation was relatively new then. And there were a lot of accidents. Not to mention, planes were shot down, people ran out of gas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So they had this problem with trying to locate life rafts. And one of the most famous people who went down was Eddie Rickenbacker, who had been a World War I flying ace. And when his plane went down, there was all this, press coverage and this and that. And they lost Eddie Rickenbacker. They lost track of him, even though they knew the plane was going to Canton Island. So they knew where he was going, and they had been in touch with air traffic control. But they couldn't find him for several weeks. And when they did find him, he wasn't in the best shape. So he was ultimately recovered. But after that, they asked Mary Sears, can you come up with a way to help us figure out where these people are drifting? Because the problem of drift is a very complicated one. So Mary Sears reached out to her contacts at Woods Hole, and she looked at all the papers available, and she put together a manual that included equations and all sorts of things to help locate men lost at sea. Another project she worked on was this silk rescue map. So we weren't the first ones to come up with rescue maps for downed pilots, but what these were maps made out of silk, because silk is waterproof, with waterproof ink, and they had current diagrams superimposed on different areas in the Pacific and other regions of the world. And the British had been working on this for a while. Again, they had been at war for several years before we were at war, and the British intelligence agency MI6 had developed this concept to help their POWs escape from German POW camps. So this was another project they worked on, just to try to help a guy figure out, if he's in a raft, which way am I supposed to be trying to get to? When the Navy ultimately named a ship after Mary Sears, they cited her work in submarine warfare. And at this time, anybody ever heard of the bathythermograph? Anybody know? Yeah, people know something about it? Yeah. Well, this is one of the early generations of the bathythermograph. So the bathythermograph was one of these really primitive instruments that someone had sort of put together a boxy version in 1934. It wasn't very efficient, and then he passed it off to a graduate student to refine and make more efficient. And that guy worked on it for a while. But at the outset of World War II, we had to get serious about this instrument, because what it does is it measures the temperature of the ocean at varying depths. And that's important for identifying thermoclines, which is where the submarines can hide. Layers of the ocean with temperature differential that causes sound waves from sonar to angulate and be unpredictable. So that's where the submarines wanted to hide. And so there was a fellow at Woods Hole named Alan Vine, an engineer, and he refined the instrument even more so that it would be incredibly more efficient and effective and reliable than what it was. And this instrument had to be deployed with a winch overboard hundreds of times to get the readings that you needed. And the way the readings were taken, there was a very primitive stylus inside the instrument that would etch a tracing on a glass slide that had been smoked and then smeared with skunk oil. So if that doesn't sound primitive enough, that sounds like something out of North Carolina, isn't that right? So yeah, and you'd have to go out and do hundreds of readings and take the glass slide out each time. And men risk their lives taking these readings off the sides of ships. But ultimately, that information was used. There were 60,000 bathythermograph slides collected during the war, and that information was accumulated and analyzed. And Mary Sears didn't do all of this by herself, but what she did was she put out a report called the Submarine Supplements to the Sailing Directions, and this included all this data about where can you find a thermocline, and it also included remarks from submarine skippers about what they found in various regions of the Pacific and how they avoided depth charges and all the things you had to watch out for in a particular region. So these were very valuable reports that she put together. This, I think, was probably the most important thing that she did during World War II. And this was not mentioned in her ship naming memo, the Joint Army-Navy Intelligence Studies that she worked on. And I was fortunate to correspond with Secretary of the Navy Richard Danzig, who had been the secretary when Mary Sears' ship was commissioned in 1999. And it was interesting. I was asking him various things that he couldn't remember. But he said to me after he read my book, he said, you got it right. He said, we didn't pick up on this part. We were just focused on what she did with submarines. But these were studies that got started mid to late 1943. Again, we've been at war almost 2 years now, and we don't have these studies. And what they were proactive studies of different regions, particularly in the Far East and in the Pacific, that would tell you everything you needed to know to characterize a battle space before you got there. So it would, include things about the terrain, the climate, the weather, the water supply, who are the native people, everything you would want to know, everything that we know now before we go to war in a particular area. And with respect to oceanography, what the Naval Oceanographic Office is doing now, they're proactively identifying potential hotspots around the globe, and they are characterizing those battle spaces with respect to the oceans before we get there. Well, we didn't have that luxury in World War II because we needed these things yesterday, and they really started coming out at the end of 1943. And you can see the kind of things that we're looking at. What were the tides, what were the waves, the currents, what was the tide at any particular time of the day. That had to be coordinated with these dawn invasions and various other factors. And Mary Sears, again, is appointed to sit on yet another Joint Chiefs Committee as the representative for oceanography. And she is it is her responsibility to make sure that these reports are done and that they're accurate, because they're for the war planners. They're for the Joint Chiefs war planners, and it's very important. And I think nothing illustrates better than the Battle of Tarawa, just how important oceanographic knowledge, intelligence, know-how could be to the Navy than the Battle of Tarawa. And the Battle of Tarawa took place in November of 1943, and there was no report, no Janus report, no oceanographic intelligence report performed in advance of that invasion, at least by these oceanographers. Now, did they have some information? Probably. But what the situation was there, at the bottom of the screen, Betty O Island is the target. It is surrounded by a coral reef. And so this is their objective. And the question on the eve of the battle is, would the tidal levels be high enough for boats to cross the reef? Now, that doesn't sound like a particularly complicated question, not to us, not these days. But it was a question that definitely befuddled the war planners at that time. So the situation was Higgins boats, the boats that had been designed for logging operations in the Louisiana swamps, they only required a 4-foot draft. And the information they had to rely on were nautical charts that were over 100 years old. They consulted foreign experts and some locals for tidal estimates. And just as a backup, they acquired a limited number of what were called LVTs, landing vehicles tracked, or Amtraks. But all they had were first generation LVTs. So these were not designed to transport troops. They were designed to transport cargo. So they were not, consequently, they were not armored, and they weren't very well tested. The mufflers were too low, so water would get them. There were a number of issues with these things. So what happened at the Battle of Tarawa? Well, essentially, the Higgins boats got up to the reef and they could not get across. And the reason they couldn't get across was because of the tides. They had been assured by the locals and all these other people that they would get at least 5 feet of tide at the time of the invasion. But what happened was, the day of the invasion, November 20th, 1943, was one of 2 days in the year when a apogean neap tide prevailed. And a neap tide, what happens with the neap tide is that the tide is extremely narrow. You're not going to have your high or your low. And when the moon is in apogee, when it's in its furthest distance from the Earth, that range gets even narrower. So as a consequence, the tide only rose to 3.3 feet for the next 48 hours, which meant that none of those landing boats could get across the reef. So what did the men have to do? They had to get out of the boats and wade to shore, something like 800 yards, the length of 8 football fields, with their rifles overhead into intense fire from machine gun fire from the Japanese. As a result, we lost 300 men just crossing the reef. And this is an eyewitness account. I've got a lot of information from oral history accounts from the Nimitz Museum, the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. And this fellow was a 17-year-old machine gunner from West Virginia, Charles Pace. He said, we'd watch these lines of Marines climb out of the Higgins boats as they worked up to the reef and then try to walk ashore, and occasionally we'd see a man disappear. Then maybe 2 or 3 men away, another one would disappear, and they would drop into the water. They were being picked off by the machine guns. So what happened with the LVTs? What happened with the backup tractors? Well, we didn't have enough of them. We only had 125 to start. And they just got shot up too. It was almost worse to get on an LVT and get shot up, because then the thing would explode, versus taking your chances jumping in into the water and wading ashore. But it was a complete disaster. And in the Battle of Tarawa, I said we lost 300 men crossing the reef. 1,000 men total died at the Battle of Tarawa. Another 2,000 casualties. And this is out of a landing force of 5,000 people. So over half of the landing force is out of commission at the Battle of Tarawa. So what happened then? Admiral Nimitz went to tour the place. He saw what a complete disaster it was. He had to wade through corpses and push them out of the way, and saw all the exploded LVTs and everything. It was a complete public relations disaster. Of course, it hit the papers. There were hearings from the Senate Naval Committee, and what Nimitz said was, what he realized was, we're going to have to do better at this. We're going to have to make some changes so that something like Tarawa doesn't happen again. Because, I mean, we're under no illusions that the amphibious campaign was going to be a cakewalk. Nobody thought it was going to be easy, but we couldn't just shoot ourselves in the foot by not knowing something as basic as tidal levels. And I don't think I have a pointer here, but at the bottom of the screen, that red circle, that's where we were in the Pacific campaign. We have all this way to go. That blue line are all the targets, those little stars. We're trying to get to Japan. We are really just at the beginning, and it's a complete disaster. So we're going to have to figure something out so that this doesn't happen again. And we did figure something out. And one of the things that I looked into, Mary Sears was on the second committee. It was called the Joint Intelligence Publishing Board. And I downloaded hundreds of pages of minutes from these meetings from the CIA Freedom of Information website. And you can see they passed around something called the priority list. And the first priority list had targets listed like Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and France, which made no sense at the point we were in the war. Well, after Tarawa, the priorities list changed drastically, and all of a sudden, the Pacific targets were elevated to the top of the list, which meant that Mary Sears and the people she worked with in oceanographic intelligence were studying. All of a sudden, we had aligned the intelligence reports with the path of the Pacific campaign. And looking at it now, it seems like, why weren't they aligned from the beginning? I don't have an answer to that question. All I can say is they did get aligned, and we never had another complete disaster, tidal disaster like Tarawa. Now there were still some mishaps. Don't get me wrong. There were still unexpected phenomena that we were not aware of, and it's, boats broke up, splintered, people drowned. Lots of stuff went on as we proceeded across the Pacific, but there was never anything as obvious as what had gone on at Tarawa. And by the time we got to Okinawa, which was the last major amphibious battle of World War II, things went much smoother. And they were able to predict a time and a date and a landing approach where the seas were calm, there was good weather, and it was a textbook landing by that time. But a lot of things changed in that interval. So we went from November of 1943 to the spring of 1945. And everybody, I think, got better at their jobs. It wasn't just the oceanographers got better and were finally turned loose to do what they did best, but of course the amphibious forces got better and our equipment got better. And everybody, we're finally like, it's like a team of football players at the beginning of the season. They're, nobody's playing together as a team, but by the end, they were, and they were playing championship level performance. So by the time we got to Okinawa, things went much smoother, and the reports were getting out earlier, and they were getting into the right hands at the right time. They weren't just getting to the war planners, they were filtering down to the operations people, and people were excerpting these reports so they could be used in the field. So what happened with these Janus reports, these Joint Army-Navy intelligence studies, there were at least 20 of these large-scale reports done during the war, and these boxes show where in the Far East they were done. They were done at many different targets that we never invaded and probably never intended to invade. But they were still needed at the end of the war, and they were needed because we were going to go we had to occupy Japan. After the Japanese surrendered, after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we had to go occupy the country and de-arm it. Well, nobody was going to roll out a red carpet and say, let us show you the way to come disarm our country. No, we still had to navigate our way. We still had to know about the aquatic hazards that we would encounter. So these reports, and we have letters written to Mary Sears and the oceanography people thanking them and saying these are the best reports we have for what we're trying to do. The other thing was there were 150 prisoner of war camps, 150 prisoner of war camps with about 60,000 prisoner of war scattered throughout this region in these places that we had not invaded, like China and Korea. We had to go find these people. And our best source of information was that information that Mary Sears and her group had pulled together. Now, after the war, Admiral Nimitz issued a commendation to Mary Sears. He said, in your capacity of oceanographer, you were frequently called upon by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to furnish critically valuable information for use in combat operations. Your performance of all these duties was at all times exceptional and beyond the high standards normally expected. This is just a short list of some of the things that this amazing, quiet, reserved, tiny marine biologist from Woods Hole did during the war. Of course, she led the oceanographic unit. She was the secretary of the subcommittee on oceanography. She did the Janus reports. She performed last-minute calculations for combat targets in the middle of the night, and she was liaison with the Woods Hole oceanographic unit. After the war, she went back to Woods Hole, where she spent her entire career, and she still wasn't allowed on the ships. She had to work from shore, and it was a time, of course, where there was no computerized data and all that sort of thing. She filled out 125,000 index cards, which were turned into 15 oversized volumes of an oceanographic index, probably the most comprehensive oceanographic index ever published. She chaired the first international Congress on Oceanography in 1959 at the UN in New York, and she co-founded the first major oceanographic journal, Deep Sea Research. So she wasn't exactly resting on her laurels. And then in 1999, the Navy commissioned her ship, the USNS Mary Sears, which is a naval oceanographic ship. And this is a picture of a naval oceanographer I met at the oceanographic office. And she, the USNS Mary Sears was operating outside of Australia recently, and our ambassador to Australia, Caroline Kennedy, went on a tour of it, and she was given a copy of this book about Mary Sears. So, I mean, I think it's somewhat ironic that a woman that was never allowed on a ship had a U.S. Navy ship named after her, but I think if she was here today that she would be quite pleased and humbled by the honor. So I just want to thank you all for having me, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
So for our audience, I know our midshipmen, many of you have to get off to class, so you can go ahead and you're dismissed to head for class. But for those who would like to stick around and have any questions, we'll go ahead and field questions in a moment.
Thank you all for coming. Hey, you're welcome.
And Dr. Musemeche will stick around, so if you want to come on up and ask any questions, we could do it one-on-one also.